get started. So, hello and welcome to session 6 for Shoe Ignite, and happy Friday to everyone. So, go ahead and grab that. All right, so today we're going to be talking about deploying websites, and we're going to be talking about CI/CD, one of my favorite topics, as well as some networking stuff, which is also one of my favorite topics. So, this will be a fun one. Basically, we'll be looking at getting all of the websites that we built up until now, finding ways to get them to actually run for other people on their own systems. So, that'll be great. As usual, the website's there. No changes to any of the exercises. So if you've had the files downloaded already, you're all good to go. Let me just make sure. Yeah, we're good. Okay. Alrighty. So starting off, we have just the first question, just as a recap from last time, which is what's the difference between the backend and the front end? So let's go ahead and present this and start the question up on top end. Okay, so for this one, the answer would have been C. So it's basically the backend is what runs on the server and the front end controls what shows up on the client. So if we remember from last time, we have the sort of server or the host is going to be the thing that's going to be actually like sending the information. And then the client is going to be the person that's downloading it. So typically, if you have somebody who's going to a website, if you're on a browser, you're going to go visit Shoe Ignite, for example, you on your browser would be the client or the user. The actual browser itself would be considered the client in this case, because it's what's actually doing the connection. And then the server itself would be the place that you actually get the website from, which would be the hosts in this case. And so, yeah. The next question is going to be, what were the main things that differentiate between static, dynamic, and static site generator based sites? That was a mouthful. Give you guys a chance to try that out. Alrighty. So for that one, the answer is going to be B. So it tells you how content changes happen. So specifically, if you're using a static site, your changes are going to be done through code. So you're going to have to go through, you're going to have to actually go up and edit the code to be able to make the change that you want to see on the site. So if you have some content, then you'll have to make it directly through the code. If you have something like a static site generator, you'll change it through whatever format you're using, whether it's Markdown, whether it's like an Excel spreadsheet, whatever it is that you're using. Is what you would change in order to change the content. And if you're using a dynamic site, you typically log into some sort of a backend or something like that to change it around. So that, so generally speaking, for A, because I saw quite a few people also put A in there, it doesn't tell you how often it changes, but what it does tell you is that the way that something changes will typically change which one you pick. So if you're going to change something every day, people aren't going to want to, go through and like change a bunch of files every single day if they're making changes. They typically don't want something where they can log in. And so that's why you'd use a dynamic system if you're going to edit something every day. Not that you have to, but just that it's probably the best system suited for that. Same thing with like, if you're changing something every day, you're not going to want to have a static site because nobody wants to write HTML for every day of their lives. So yeah, so B is the correct answer in this case. Alrighty, so last episode, we talked about static sites and static site generators. And so today we're going to talk about kind of how to host both those two. So basically, how do we actually get them online so people can see them? It's great that we can see them on our own machine, but unless we're going to make people install Python and run all of our stuff, or we're going to make them install a bunch of other stuff and send them the files, we need some way for them to be able to see it. So first off, we're going to start with what GitHub is. So we've been using it to download the files that we've had for the exercises for the weeks. So every time that you went there to go and download the files, that is the platform called GitHub. And what it is basically a service that lets you download Git repositories. It's just a fancy name for a file folder, except for it has a bit of a twist to it. And that twist is that it stores what's called changes. So basically, it's what's called a version management system. So every time that somebody makes a change to any of the files that are in there, it gets stored in Git. And so what that means is that you can go back to previous versions if you screw something up, or inevitably when you screw something up, essentially. Now, that's super handy, but there's also some other extra features of Git as to what GitHub specifically that we'll be using later today that makes it really nice for us to be able to host websites on as well. But Git is something that you should also get used to. It's a super handy tool if you're going to be going further with your development stuff. You'll find a lot of stuff on Git. And so just for your own interest, basically the reason why you use Git version management, there's a lot of good other reasons for this, but essentially it's just that when you make a mistake, when you accidentally produce some sort of a bug that you can't figure out how to fix, it will show you actually like what you did the last time you changed something around. So just as an example, if we go ahead and take a look at github.com and then we go to, let's just say we go to the Shoe Ignite website, for example, we can see here we have about 800 commits. I can go back all the way back to the very first thing that was ever committed from the website and go all the way to all the steps in between there. So I can see all the changes I've ever made to the entire Shulk Unite website throughout its entire history for the last couple of years that it's been running. So super handy. And if I want to see, for example, okay, what did these files change? Right. So I go ahead and take a look at it and it tells me, oh, look, I added a file. In this case, it's going to be, sorry, I updated a file called good.instruction and I have this information on there. Right. So basically just tells you all the changes you made as you go through. Super handy. And with that, there is some articles that we've listed on the site, as well as a recording that we did on the topic. If you're interested in doing it from scratch, we're going to do it the lazy way today, and we're just going to be using the web interface to upload files. So you don't have to know how to use Git already. We're going to be just using the interface to drag and drop files to it. So super easy. And the reason that we care about GitHub specifically, there's tons of places that you can use Git. Git doesn't actually just belong to GitHub. There's GitLab, there's Bitbucket, there's other places that let you use Git. But the nice thing about GitHub is what's called GitHub Pages. And this is basically a service that they started up a couple of years ago that lets you host websites using Git. So you can have all of your code stored on the website. You can download it. You can mess around with it. You can change it however much you want. And you have the versions there and you can host websites through it, which is super handy. And so GitHub Pages basically just lets you host static sites. So essentially when you have some sort of a website that has an HTML file, specifically what's called an index.html file is what we're going to create, that'll let us have sort of whatever site we need to have. So this is often used, people will often store like documentation for their own websites inside the same repository that they store the source code. Good example of this, if I go ahead and take a look at one of the projects that I have in here, let's say, I think AHD does this. If we look at this, there is essentially the code for the project itself. And then inside docs, there's a markdown file and a bunch of markdown files. And then if we go to the actual GitHub Pages stuff, these are all just HTML files that get put out. So you can have everything you want for a certain project all in one place, which is super handy for GitHub Pages. But we just care about hosting static sites today. And so the way that works is there's basically 4 main steps. So the first one, you have to have a GitHub account. I believe during session 0, you would have created one. If you haven't, just head to signup.github.com and you should be able to, or it might be github.com/signup. I forget what it is. But if you Google GitHub sign up, you can just sign up for it right now. We're going to create a repository, which is basically creating a fancy folder. We're going to upload our files. We're going to make sure that you have an index.html. If you're using EasyCV or any of the other stuff that we've been doing, you should be able to have one of those files already. This basically index.html is a fancy name for homepage. You can think about it like saying main page, homepage, whatever. This is just an old thing that people used to do in the 90s and it stuck around forever. So most website hosting providers will need you to have an index.html, and that's considered to be like your homepage, the first page that people go to, essentially. And then once we have the files all uploaded, we're going to tell the repository itself to publish the files. So publish them out on GitHub Pages, and then we're going to wait for GitHub to publish your site. I'm hoping they told you this during session 0, but if they didn't, I'll tell you this now if you're signing up for it. Don't pick an unfortunate name for your GitHub account because it will show up in the URL. So don't get too spicy with it because it'll show up there. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's look at how this kind of goes. So once we've created a GitHub account, you can just head to github.com and typically it'll look something like this. It'll just be like this kind of a feed page, and you'll probably have less stuff on here because I have a bunch of projects going on, but it'll look something broadly like this. It might be light themed. You can change that later if you want. But in the top right-hand corner here, there'll be a little plus. If we go ahead and click that, there'll be the option to create a new repository. So if we go ahead and click on that, we'll be given a whole bunch of options. Some of these won't show up for you because I have some configurations that are a little bit different, but essentially in here, the things that matter are the repository name, the description, and everything that follows kind of afterwards. And so for us, the thing that we care about, if this is your first website, which in this case, I assume it will be, unless people have already started putting up websites. If you have, you'll have to do something different than this. But your first websites, what you'll want to do is do whatever your username is .github.io. So in my case, let me just zoom this in a little bit. So in my case, that would be descent098.github.io. And that's what you'd use. As you can see here, it's going to error out because I already have a personal website on github.io. But for you, that's what you'd want to do as your very first website, would be whatever your username is, .github.io. For me, I'm just going to put gibberish in there because I'm going to get rid of this later anyways. Description, you can choose if you want to or not. It's entirely up to you. Public or private, doesn't matter. You can have a private repository that also has public facing like pages sites. So don't worry about this, like not allowing people to see your website. You can use README if you want, doesn't really matter. This is basically just a thing that shows up to tell people what your project is about. And then you don't need to care about any of this. And then license-wise, you don't really need to care. But if you're going to pick one, I would just pick MIT if you want to keep it easy. And then once we've done that, so let's go ahead and I'll check in an MIT license on this one. And I'll go ahead and hit create. And in here, this is what we kind of currently have. So we have just kind of like a blank page that just says initial commit, and then it says license. Cool, perfect, good stuff. So now what we can do is we can upload our files. And because we're lazy, we're just going to drag them in here. So we can see here, if you go into today's exercises, there's a page called Alan. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to literally copy all of this stuff. I'm going to go ahead and drag it into here. And do it one more time because it didn't quite upload. There we go. It's now going to upload everything for us. So that's great. We don't have to do anything else. We don't have to learn how to use anything else in Git. We can just do that. So once it's finished uploading all of these things, we'll see a list of all the different things that we're adding in here. And then we can make a notice in here. So we can have like a message to say what we changed. So we can say we uploaded site files, and then we can go ahead and just hit commit, which basically says that we're going to send off those changes. It's going to take a little bit to process those changes. And then when we come back to the code section here, give it a second. There we go. We can see all of our files now have shown up in there. And then once we actually have our files, we now have to tell GitHub Pages to make it show up. So what we can do is we go into the settings, and then under where it says pages, we just say deploy from a branch. So in this case, actually, we can just say main in this case, and we'll just leave it on this. If you put your files inside of a folder, so like if you have you can put a folder in there called site, and then you can like select whichever folder you want to use. In our case, we're just going to use the main folder, which is like this where it says root just literally means this main folder that we're looking at here. So just use this folder that we're looking at is what root means. And then once we hit save, that'll go ahead and that'll publish the site. For you guys, it will be on, it'll be under whatever the name you have in there is. So it'll be under your username.github.io. For me, it will be somewhere else because I have custom domains set up on all this. But that's it. That's all you have to do to be able to set up a GitHub Pages site. So once it basically runs through, what you'll see here, if I go ahead and refresh, you'll see here there's a little orange thing. This is basically the system going through and doing everything for us. So if we go ahead and check out the details of this, it'll actually tell us what it's currently doing. So it says, okay, I had to set up some stuff. It had to do some pulling, grab a bunch of stuff. Okay, now it's doing some sort of reporting stuff. And then it's also deploying at the same time. So once all of these steps are finished, we can watch them kind of run. It's going to say, yeah, okay, that worked. Cool. Everything's all check marks. If we go back to our page now, we can see here that there's a thing that says deployments. If we click on that, we can see, okay, there's all the information. If we click on the little thing over here, we'll see what that page looks like. In my case, it's under kieranwood.ca because my main domain is set up with GitHub Pages. For you, it'll be under the site that you set before. And that's it. That's basically, we have that site now all set up and we can just go from there. So if we want to see some of the other pages, we can just go through there as we need to. And that's basically it. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you guys a chance to try out what you just saw there. And if you do manage to get that site up and running, if you have any of the other sites left over from any of the other sessions, you can try uploading those as well. Just make sure that you do have an index.html as well. So we'll give you guys a chance to try that out. So apologies for that. But Fanny just chucked a link in chat for everybody to take a look at. This is basically just a feedback form. If you guys wouldn't mind filling it out as we go through the rest of the session, that would be great. So hopefully the exercise went well for everybody. One thing that I did want to mention is that when you are setting up these websites, if you do set up like another website down the road, it will still add it to your GitHub Pages domain account sort of thing. So what will end up happening actually is, let me just quickly pop open drawing. A new section down here. So essentially what's going to happen is that there'll be a certain domain associated with your account. So by default, it'll be your username. So let's say we have kind of our domain here. We have our main site. Let's say it's kieran.github.io, right? If you go ahead and you were to add another project to it, let's say, for example, you added a project that was called, I don't know, bird. It's a site about birds. I guess you weren't very creative with the name. If you go ahead and you added in a site called bird and it was over here, right? What ends up happening is that the URL goes from whatever this root URL is. So root's URL, and then everything else goes at whatever root URL / whatever the project name is. So kieran.github.io would be kind of my main domain. And then from there, if I had bird, which was the name of the project, just sitting over here, then what we would end up with as far as the URL would be kieran.github.io/bird. And that would be where index.html would open up to. And then let's say I had a file inside of bird that was called about.html. That would be kieran.github.io/bird/about. So essentially everything just kind of gets tagged on from there, if that makes sense. So when we're taking a look at, for example, the site that I just created, which is handling name staff, that one is available at kieranwood.ca because that's where my main actual homepage website is right now, and that's where my main domain is. And then from there, I have /sadafstuff, which is basically like the actual homepage, the index.html of that project. And then I have a file called mywork.html. And so when I go there, it's mywork.html. So whenever you're doing any of these URLs, you're trying to find stuff, just keep in mind that's whatever the URLs will be as you go. Okay. So with that, I have far too many windows open on this side. There we go. And there we go. Okay, perfect. So there's some alternatives if you are interested, or if for some reason in the future GitHub Pages ever has some issues, you can feel free to take a look at some of these other ones as well. There's plenty of other options for free hosting. For static sites, the reason why static sites are great, and the reason why it's great if you can try and get a lot of sites into static sites, is that especially if you don't want to have to pay for them, most of the hosting for static sites is either free or basically free. Like AWS and Cloudflare, you might be paying like 2 cents a month or something like that. If you have a lot of visitors, like it's not very expensive for you to host websites on these places. So just keep that in mind. And that's kind of why it's oftentimes the best option. Okay, so for static site generators, we have a similar process, but first we have to actually generate the files. So static site generators, obviously, when we're taking a look at something like, for example, I just went in and just ran, I think I still have this open. I went in and ran easycp init, like we saw last time, where that's going to create a site. And then that's created a folder called Kieran. And then inside here, we have kind of our source files. But then if we want to actually be able to see our site, we'd have to do something like easycp build, right? And that's going to go through, and that's going to export everything into this site folder. And there it is, right? Now, that's fine. That does work, right? But it's kind of annoying that we have to make sure that we always run this before we upload the files. So the question is, what is there actually that we can do to try and automate that process? Like what can we get it to do where it runs that command every single time that we upload the files? And then that way we don't have to keep constantly running it ourselves and making sure to upload those changed files all the time as well. Enter what's called CI/CD. And CI/CD is the best thing for people who are incredibly lazy and who want to spend 12 hours automating something that takes 5 seconds to do. So it's a great process. Basically, the main gist is that repetitive tasks kind of suck, especially tasks that are really boring. You don't want to have to do them yourself. And so CI/CD basically makes sure that you actually run commands properly and that they're run at the same time and they have sort of steps documented for everything. So if you want to do something consistently and you want it to be run at certain times, CI/CD is a great way of making sure that actually happens. So if you want it to go through and spell check your code every single time you upload it and then give you a report, CI/CD is great for that. If you want it to go through and do checking to see that you didn't like accidentally delete something that's really important or like share a password, CI/CD is great for doing that. If you want it to do the static site building stuff that we saw before, CI/CD is great for that. Anything that you don't want to deal with and that can be run on kind of a regular interval, CI/CD is going to be the best option for stuff like that. So yeah, imagine you have this sort of situation where you work at a software company, your boss tells you that you got to make sure that every time that somebody commits some code to our system that they basically send to you to have put in there, you make sure you spell check it, make sure every new function has some documents attached to it, make sure it has the name of the contributor to every file, and then check for some security flaws. Doing this sucks. And so automating it away, you can do things like writing scripts. So let's say, for example, you write a bunch of scripts, you go through and you run those scripts every single time, right? You might have like a bash script or a PowerShell script if people are familiar with those, where you go through, you run the script and it works. Great. But there's some problems. If they're your tools and you forget to document your own tools, then there might be some issues down the road. And so that's why you want this to be automated, but you want it to be automated in a way that other people can also use. Which is the other advantage of using CI/CD, is that typically it's set up in a way where there's usually like one configuration file and you use that configuration file to basically do everything. So anybody can use your CI/CD system is what you're trying to aim for. And so, yeah, CI/CD basically just means continuous integration and continuous delivery. These are technically two different things, but people use them interchangeably. If you want the technical definition, continuous integration is basically sort of meant to solve that problem we talked about earlier with running things whenever you like kind of want to. Continuous delivery is basically just making sure that your products are always up and running. So it's a little bit more complicated, but if you're interested, you can always read about this later. So essentially what we're going to do, long story short, TLDR of this slide is that we're going to write some sort of a configuration file. That configuration file is going to tell GitHub to run some commands on our code every single time that we add new changes. So we make a change to the file, it's going to trigger it to read the configuration file and do something to make sure that everything is all working for us. And that's basically the gist of what we're going to try and get done today. So yeah, going back at our previous example, you could have set up a CI/CD pipeline to do all those things for you, and then you never have to touch it again, really. You can just let it run, and it'll give you the warnings. It'll do everything for you. So just some terms, just so you know what they are. I know, very boring. Everybody's really excited to learn about terms, but I swear to God, it's useful. I promise, just stick with me, bear with me. So a computer or a virtual machine is going to be the system that's going to run our pipelines, and pipeline is going to be the name for sort of the configuration file that we're going to be setting up, and also the sort of the runs that are going to be happening. So a run will be what happens when a pipeline is activated, and each of those runs, or sometimes called jobs, will kind of like show up in our system afterwards. And so a virtual machine is kind of like a mini computer that's going to run some sort of an operating system, and it's going to be what runs our commands for us. So it might be something that's running something like Linux or Windows or Mac OS, whatever it might be that you might need. Essentially, a virtual machine is going to be like a fake computer that's going to be running that for us. And then oftentimes what we'll have to set is what's called an environment variable. We'll see this later on. These actually exist on your current computer right now. There's actually a whole bunch of these that already exist that you can use if you really wanted to for a lot of programming things. But we are going to use them today to kind of configure what we want to happen. So we can set environment variables to tell it, maybe for some of our releases, we want it to do something different. We can basically set certain environment variables at certain times to make sure that shows up. If you're interested in virtual machines or containers, there's an introduction to them here. But the first thing to look at is what's called a job or a step. So you can think of a job or a step kind of like a function. And so essentially, if we had like one or more commands that we ran, then that would be sort of a job or a step. So if we're looking at something like, let's say Python, and then we're going to run some certain file. So we have some sort of a file that's going to do a bunch of stuff, then that would be a job or a step. And then we might have a job in our pipeline that runs the job that you see above, essentially. So you might have some stuff in there that'll run a whole bunch of jobs in once, or it might have a whole bunch of those sort of steps at once, all that sort of stuff. And then, yeah, the pipeline and flows are what contain the actual steps, and they also contain sort of the configuration values for everything. And these are all going to be inside of YAML files. So we talked about YAML last time. YAML is also being used for this. So to recap, we have an environment that'll be some sort of a fake machine, a virtual machine, that's going to go through. It's going to look at our pipeline. It's going to run it. And then our pipeline is going to run multiple jobs until it hits the end of the file. Okay. There's some other systems you can take a look at if you're interested. The only one that might also be kind of interesting is Nox, which is a local Python version of CI/CD. So if you want to have this run locally on your own machine, Nox is an option that you can use as well. It's kind of cool. Okay, so let's look at how you can actually start creating these things, because we talked enough about them. Let's actually start creating one. So before you ever write any CI/CD pipelines, make sure you can actually do what you're trying to do on your own machine. Because if you can't get it working locally, you're definitely not going to get it working in the cloud, and you're just going to annoy yourself. Trust me, I've been through this many times. You spend like 5 or 6 hours looking at something. It gets very annoying. So make sure that you can run it locally. So we know what we want to do in our case, right? We want to run easycb build, right? To be able to build our site and then have those files there. Okay, we know exactly what we want to do. Perfect. So what we're going to do is when we create this file, we're going to basically build like a step-by-step guide for our system to follow. We're going to tell the computer exactly what to run, when to run it, how to run it. So our main goal is, all right, we want to publish a site to using easycb. So we have some sort of an easycb setup. We want to take those files. We want to run easycb build, and then we want to have that folder be uploaded to GitHub pages. Cool, perfect. So generate the HTML by running GitHub build and then export, right? That's all we need to do. So we're good to go, right? I'm guessing people can probably figure out that's not the only thing that we have to do. So this is the setup that we'd want to run, right? We want to run easycb build. You can also tell it a specific folder to send out to if you really want to. You can say -d and then you can put a folder name in. So if you want to use something other than the word site, you can do that if you're interested, right? And then to get it to show up on GitHub pages, once it's actually been there, we just want to go ahead and like copy the files and put them up on GitHub pages, right? So the problem with this is that this is actually all that we need technically from our end as far as what we need to do locally. But locally, there's a lot of things that we've already assumed have happened. So we've already assumed that we have a computer running. So like I said before, we have to set up an environment. So we have to tell it what to run initially. We assume that we already have the files ready to go. We've assumed that we have Python and EasyCV installed. So when you're making CI/CD pipelines, 9 out of the 10 errors that you're going to run into are going to be you forgot to do something beforehand, right? So, you're running through and you're like, why isn't this working? It's working on my machine. I don't understand what's happening. Why isn't it like doing it properly? And then you realize that, oh, whoops, I spelled Python wrong. And now I'm installing Python instead of Python. So it'll be stuff like that where you're going through and you have to set something up and you just miss something as you go through. So what do the steps actually look like for doing this? So first we need to pick an operating system that we're going to use. Then we need to download the files that we're going to need to do our EasyCV build on. We're going to need to set up Python, set up EasyCV, run our commands, and then export that to GitHub pages. So you can see here, the last 2 steps are the same 2 steps that we saw before, but we have all these other steps we have to do before we can even run those. So keep that in mind whenever you're doing this in the future. Make sure that the assumptions that you're making about what stuff is already installed is actually the case for your CI/CD system before you run it. Because, you forget to install Python, you're not going to be able to run Python code. No matter how hard you try, if you don't have Python installed, it's not going to help you. You're not going to be able to do it. I promise. So, okay, let's look at how to actually do this. So we're going to be using GitHub again, because this is going to be the easiest way of doing it. And we're going to be using what's called GitHub Actions. And so GitHub Actions is basically the system that runs our CI/CD pipelines for us in GitHub. And luckily, all of this is all free. Yay. So the way that it works is that we need to create a YAML file in, there'll be a folder called .github/workflow. So if we're taking a look, by default, any EasyCV site that you see will already have this folder for you. So you can see here we have .github and we have workflows, and then we have kind of this YAML file. So if we pop this open, this is kind of spoilers for what we're about to cover in 2 seconds here, but we can actually, let me grab the right folder. There we go. This is what it looks like to do everything that we just talked about. So this is basically going to be what we're going to do in order to get everything up and running. And this is what we're going to basically build as we go here. So all this is already set up for you inside the EasyCV stuff. But what we're going to cover is what it actually all means so that you can go through and change it as you need to. Okay. So that .github folder, by the way, also has a ton of other uses that are really cool. So you should also, there's a link down here that tells you about some of the other stuff that you can do in here. You can set up like fancy things so that when people try to like report issues with your projects and stuff like that, you can get like fancy forms and stuff. So it's a really cool folder you can take a look at, and you can get it to automate a whole bunch of things for you as well. So definitely take a look at that. Okay. So typically, whenever you're going through your files and you're setting up your pipelines, there's some things you want to make sure. You want to make sure that everything has a name and a label. You want to make sure that you set up a trigger to say when you want it to run. You're going to do environment variables. Sometimes you don't need these, but usually you will. And then the last one's going to be the jobs, which is going to be the actual steps you're going to take. All right. So the name of the label is just going to be the thing, like a title, basically, for your config. So what are you actually doing? So in our case, we're going to do a GitHub build for EasyCV. That's our name. That's what we're trying to do. If you're doing something like, run testing, then you might call it run testing. Whatever you're actually trying to do, just put it in there, because if you can have more than one GitHub action run at a time. And so when you go into the actions page, they'll all show up there. So if you have everything called like file 1, file 2, file 3, you're not going to know which one's doing what. So just keep that in mind. And then the next thing is triggers. This basically will let you tell GitHub when to run the project, like when to actually run the CI/CD pipelines. There's tons of different options for this. You can actually run it on like different date schedules. You can run it on when somebody does a specific thing. You can run it on when there's specific files that are added. There's a whole bunch of different options. For us, this code that we're looking at here, where it says on, so we have an on object that has a push attribute, which is also an object that has a branches attribute, which is a list. And so long story short, what this is saying here is whenever new code is added is the on push part. And then the branches basically just says whenever new code is added to a specific, what's called a branch on GitHub, which you can look up what Git branches are later. But basically these 2 options here where it says master or main are the 2 options to say, hey, whenever somebody uploads files to the main section of the code. So whenever we uploaded files earlier, we uploaded it to the main branch here. Sometimes older systems are called master. So you just include both of those and then you're good to go. So basically every time we upload some files, we're going to have it show up and we're going to want to run this file essentially. You can also have it run like every Tuesday at 3:15 p.m. if you really want to. Whatever you want to do, doesn't really matter, but the triggers just need to be there so that you know, so that GitHub knows when to run it. So the two other triggers that I was just talking about there. So schedule, this is a way of doing it where you can say run it at 2 p.m. on a Monday, Tuesday, and Friday, for example, if you want to have that, or a workflow dispatch, which lets you run it manually. So if you only want to do it when you say so, you can just do workflow dispatch. And there's links for both of these you can click on to get details about those. You can also have more than one. So for the Schulke Ignite site, for example, we have it set so that it goes up every time somebody makes some new code changes on master, but we also have it set up so that every new blog post goes out at the correct time as well. So you can have multiple of these as well. All right. So at this point, if we go back to our file, just look at what we're covering so we don't forget. So at this point, we've covered this part of the file here. So we got our name set up and we got when we want it to show up, right? We want it to run whenever somebody makes any changes to the main sort of branches there. Perfect. Okay. So now the question is, what actual steps do we want it to take? And so the first step that we want to do, so a lot of the times what you'll end up seeing, so this job section, a lot of the times you'll end up seeing just one job, or at least you will for me because I'm lazy. So jobs technically just contain steps. You can have multiple jobs if you really want to. I don't tend to bother with it. I tend to just do everything all in one job because the steps themselves are already a separate thing. So you can do this in multiple jobs if you wanted to, and then have one step per job. I'm lazy. I'm not going to do that. So I just put everything in one job, but you can if you really want to. So in our case, what we're going to say is, hey, we want to build the site. Perfect. Okay. So then we have to tell it what we want it to run with. You could say Windows here. You could say Windows. You could say Linux. You could say Mac OS. In this case, we're using Ubuntu, which is Linux. And then from there, we have the steps. So I'm taking a look at this now. Yeah, the name, the runs on, and then the steps. So the runs on, for the most part, you can just use Ubuntu latest just because it's going to be fastest because it's the smallest operating system. So unless you need something Windows specific, you can just run it on that. You can also run it on all three. So if you're trying to do testing, for example, down the road, you can actually run it on all three. And there's fancy settings to let you do that as well, which I don't think I included in here. No, I didn't. Okay. But there is a way to do it if you want to. If you want to run your tests to make sure that they work on all devices, you could do that as well. Instead of having to, go out and buy a MacBook, go out and buy a bunch of these things, you can just run them all at once. Okay. So each step is basically, so this is essentially just an array when you look at them. So these are basically just an array of objects that have sort of the information on them. So in our case, the first item here is going to say checkout repo. This is a fancy way of saying download the files. Okay, so our first step, download files. Perfect. Second step, we're going to download Python. Perfect. Cool. And when we say this uses, this is basically saying what we're going to use to do this with. And there is, I don't know if I have, yeah, I do have it on here. So if we go ahead and check out, there's a thing called the marketplace. And this has everything you can imagine for being able to automate stuff with. So I'll go ahead and send that in the chat there. Basically, you can set up whatever you want. We're using it in the context of web development, but if you guys down the road decide to do Android development or do something like that, let's say, for example, you don't want to buy an iPhone, there's like stuff in here that'll let you build iPhone apps without having to have a Mac device, for example, and stuff like that. Like there's a whole bunch of other things that you can get on here that are super useful. So just keep that in mind that this isn't just related to web development stuff, there's other stuff that you can do with this. But we basically pick the things that we're going to need. So in our case, we're going to need to first download our files, which is always called a checkout. And then we're going to get Python set up, and then we're going to install stuff. And so what this does here, this run section here, is just going to literally run commands like we are in a terminal. So in our case, we're doing pip install -- upgrade pip. That upgrades pip. This section also just sets up what's called a wheel. And then we go ahead and we install EasyCB. So this is just installing EasyCB, basically, is what this step does. We could have whatever commands you want to run here, which means that you can use anything that's available to you on the command line. So anything that you can run at the command line, you can run by doing run, and then just having a string of whatever you want to run there. So super handy. Literally anything you can do with a computer, you can do on CSD. And then once you've installed everything, we're going to build our files, which will send it to the site repository. And then we're going to use this one at the end here, which is another action that will let us pick a folder, and then that'll upload it to GitHub Pages for us. So we can take a look at this. So we have these different steps, same sort of stuff that I was just covering there, basically just one by one going through, getting everything set up, and then building it from there. Yeah, like I said, putting it all together, we have a name, we have our triggers to say when we want to run it, we have our jobs, and then we have our steps inside of those jobs after we have our runs on. And that gets everything all set up for us, and we can run whatever we want for it. So let's look at our original steps. So we have set up a trigger and a name, set up an operating system, which is going to be our runs on. We're going to download our source files, which is our checkout. We're going to set up Python. We're going to install EasyCV, and then we're going to build and export it, which is basically what we just looked at inside that file that's available there. And so this is just going to walk you through slow doing the exact same thing that I was just talking about before. So every one of those steps is available and documented on here as well. Okay. So once we've done that, we still have to tell, if we haven't already, we still have to tell GitHub where to go. So if we were to go back to our GitHub pages folder, so we go to here, we go to pages, it's just going to be under the specific folder that we need to pick. So we could say site, but I believe when this uploads, it'll actually upload just to the root of your GitHub pages branch. So you actually want to pick this where it says deploy from a branch. And instead of main, there'll be one that shows up here called gh-pages. So I believe if I go ahead and I check out, I'm trying to think what else will have this. I think HD has this. So if I go ahead and check out the settings for this project instead, there is, a folder. So there's a branch here called GitHub pages, and that'll be where it'll end up. So this last step here, we'll upload it to the GH pages branch. So you just have to set that in there instead of setting it to the main thing. And that's it. You're good to go. And if you want to see what that looks like, what the output is, you can come back here, and instead of master, you just select GitHub pages, and it'll show you all of the files that you're looking at. Okay, been talking for a while now. I think there should be exercise coming up in a second here. So so once we have those pipelines set up, you can also use it to trigger other pipelines. So if you want multiple things to happen at once, you can have more than one pipeline going, essentially. So to recap, we kind of send out stuff from our machine. That's kind of the files that we send out, which then from the repository, it sees that there's been files uploaded, which activates our trigger. Our trigger runs our pipeline, and then that gets uploaded to the GitHub pages branch, which then the GitHub pages server will start showing to people. So it does all of this stuff for us all at once, but we only have to set this up one time. And then from there, we just make changes to our files and upload them, and we're good to go if we want to use a static site generator, and that's it. Okay, and so like I said before, EasyCV does include this pipeline by default, which is why for this next part, what we're going to talk about is there is a repository that's already available. So the link to it will be in the slides. I'll just copy the link and send it in here as well. And this is what's called a template repository. So we can go ahead and click on this. The nice thing about this is that we can just click up in the corner here and say, use this template to create a new repository. We can name it whatever we want in here. And when we do this, just make sure to check off the thing that says include all branches and go ahead and hit create. And what that does basically is that's just a glorified way of saying, hey, whenever I'm looking at this folder, make a copy of this folder and let me create one on my own system here. So you can see here, this one has been created for me. And now what I can do is I can just go into settings and then into GitHub pages, and I can just make sure that that's turned on and we're good to go. As long as that's on, it'll now go through and it'll do all the build steps, which are currently running right now. All right, so I'll give you guys a chance to try that out. So, like I said before, CI/CD can be used for a whole bunch of things. A lot of things that you're too lazy to do, or I'm too lazy to do at least. So all that stuff is kind of over here for if you're interested in some other stuff that you can do with it. There's also some examples here. So there's examples with Shulk Knights and some other stuff. Tons of really cool things over there. Okay. So far, what we've looked at is we have some files. We upload the files to GitHub pages. Magic happens. Our page is on the internet. But the question is, okay, what's actually happening behind the scenes? What is GitHub pages actually doing that's making it so that we can actually see some things, right? And so that's where we have to talk a little bit about networking. And people try and make this a lot more complicated than it needs to be. But essentially, when we're looking at networking, the big thing is thinking about what's something that you need to send somebody a message. So in the case of email, you need kind of an email address and you need some content that you need to send somebody, right? In the case of actual mail, you need something like their address, the content, whatever you're going to put it in, and then somebody to take it, essentially, right? Phone, you need a phone number, and you need, well, something to talk about, right? The commonality between all these things is you need somewhere to send something, and you need something to send, essentially, is what you need to care about, right? And the same thing with receiving stuff back. you need to also have your own sort of like address or something that somebody can send something back to and send the information back to you, essentially, right? And so networking is mostly about just finding a way to make sure to do that as efficiently and as easy as possible. And that's the real big thing with networking that you're looking for, right? How do I communicate with somebody? How do I get that information back and forth between us? So that's what browsers need. So the browsers need some sort of a way to communicate to something and be able to receive the information back, right? That's the biggest thing that they care about. And so with this, if I want to go to schulkenite.com, the things I need to know are, where is schulkenite.com? I mean, I don't need to know like which country it's in, but I need to know like where I can actually go, what computer actually has the information that I need to be able to get that, right? I need to know how to ask for the content and have some sort of a way to get that content back. And so for this, basically the first question of where it is going to be the host. So schulkenite.com will there is some computer somewhere that's run by GitHub that has those files on it. And so when you type in schulkenite.com, your browser has to be able to get to that computer in order to ask for those files, and then it has to receive them back. So schulkenite.com is the host, and then you're the client who is basically asking for those files back. And that's what all of this stuff for networking does. So it all has different pieces and components as to what it has to do to be able to get you that information, right? So first it has to be able to translate schulkenite.com into some sort of a way to contact the computer, get that information, and then pass it back to you. And also, yeah, big thing with this, don't bother trying to memorize especially don't memorize like the terms and stuff. Just understand, especially like the pieces that are going back and forth. The things that you need to care about are just how this is kind of happening and why different pieces are important. That's what the main thing. So you don't have to like memorize like standards and names and like what specific things stand for. That's not really the important part. The important part is, oh, right, I need some sort of a domain name like schulkenite.com in order for people to not have to type a long IP address in, or I need some sort of HTML content so I can actually send something back to the user, that sort of stuff. So the first thing that we have to talk about is what's called HTTP. And so it stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. That's not really important. The thing that is important is what it does. And what it does is it's basically the way that we talk. It's essentially the rules that define how one computer talks to another computer across the network. And so there's lots of things. The two main parts that get sent are essentially going to be what's called your headers, and it's going to be your body. So the way that HTTP works is somebody will send off a request. Typically, it'll be your browser. You'll send off a request to something with a bunch of headers. So that'll be kind of like if you imagine like sending an email, for example, and you say like, hey, here's some information. I'm sending off this email. Here's my email address, and here's the email address I want to send it to. I got to send this information off, right? That'll all be sent as part of the headers. So it'll have a bunch of information. It'll say things like host, clients, and it'll have the addresses for each of those things. So the host, it might say something like, hey, I'm trying to send this to schulkenite.com, just as an example. And then the client might be like, hey, this is my address, right? This is my information. This is where you can send messages back to so that I can get the information back, right? All that'll be part of the headers. And then the actual content will be part of what's called the body. So that'll be like if you're trying to send like some information about like, let's say Instagram, you're trying to send an image to something, then you'll have to attach that image content to the body and then send that along with your headers in order to tell Instagram what you want to do, where you want to send it to, and the actual stuff that you want to send, essentially. So those are the two parts of each of the messages. And then HTTP itself has two different types of messages. One is a request, one is a response. And each of them will have different headers depending on which one you're sending. So yeah, so essentially you'll send a request off. Let's say you say, hey, I want to get schulkenite.com. I want to get the whatever page you have available for schulkenite.com. You'll send up what's called a GET request to schulkenite.com, and it will send you back a response of HTTP, which will include the HTML for that page. And that's basically what it does. And then you just keep doing that back and forth until you have all the stuff that you want, essentially. One thing that's important to keep in mind with HTTP, at least most of the versions that you'll be working with, especially HTTP 1, is that it doesn't like keep a connection open. So don't think of it like a phone call. Think of it like a mail, like you're actually mailing something to somebody, right? You're sending off these messages and you're getting these responses back, but it's not like you're not keeping a constant connection like you would with a phone call where you're constantly being connected to the person. You have to be able to send all the information that they need all in one go so that you can send all information that they have to send back to you all at one go. So it all goes back and forth like that. And that's essentially how HTTP works. And we'll be talking about it in more detail next week. We'll be going into the specifics of it, as well as setting up servers, our own sort of servers to be able to run this stuff. That'll be a little bit easier to work with, and it'll allow us to do things that are fancier. So we can send back responses that aren't just HTML, and we can do a lot of other fancy things with it essentially. So we're going to be looking at that next week. But if you are interested, there's also this series that we added on the blog that does talk about how to write your own HTTP server. This is more in depth than we're going to be going into next week. Next week, we're going to be using a library that does this all for us. But essentially, under the hood, everything's going to be using HTTP. And then the other important aspect of this is what's called domain names and domain name registrars. And so whenever we're sending something to shuluknight.com, for example, what we're actually doing is computers basically talk in IP addresses. So everywhere around the world, computers will have different IP addresses. There's two different types. IPv4 is the one that's available right here, which is nice and short. IPv6 is an awful monstrosity. But basically, whenever you're talking to a computer, your computer will ask for the other computer's address, basically, and then it'll send the information back and forth between them. It will also use a system called ports, which is another fancy thing. Essentially, the IP address kind of refers to the actual device that you're looking for, and the port, you can basically have up to 9,999 ports. I think you actually have more than that, ports available on a computer, so you can have a bunch of different services. So you could have like one website running out of port 80, one website running out of port 443, one website running out of port 2,467, whatever you want. Basically, you attach those all to a port, and then computers can talk to each other, and they can talk to each other on specific ports, so they can only get access to specific things that each computer is sending back and forth. And so obviously, this would kind of suck if instead of having to type in Google, you'd have to type in like 137.154.1.1, whatever, every single time you want to go there. So instead, what we have is what's called a DNS server, which basically allows them to have google.ca. And when you type in google.ca, it goes and finds what the computer is that's configured for google.ca as far as the IP address, and then it sends you there. And so, yeah, so whenever you type in shuluknight, you don't type in this address, which is the address for GitHub pages. There's actually 4 different addresses for GitHub pages, but this is one of them. So you don't actually type this in. So what actually happens? So you type in shuluknight.com, that will go through your internet service provider, whoever it is, TELUS, Shaw, whatever. That will go out to the internet, and it will talk to these DNS services. So it'll talk to a whole bunch of different ones. In our case, what we're using is what's called Cloudflare. So it'll go ahead and it'll talk to Cloudflare, and it'll say, hey, look, I'm looking for shuluknight.com. I saw that you're the one who is registered with. Where am I going? What am I looking for? And it'll send it back. Hey, here's the IP address. Go and talk to it. The port's 443. Go and ask them for the information you need. And then from there, your computer will store that information locally on its own system. And then every time that it tries to send a message to shuluknight.com, it will just go to that IP address and it'll ask for the content back and forth. And then all that happens is literally it just sends the text of the file along with the text of the headers back and forth between the computers. So the entire exchange of the internet is literally just text being passed back and forth. That's basically a simplification of it, but that's essentially all that's happening. You're just sending text back and forth between computers. And so, yeah, so domain names are basically the thing that you actually purchase. So that would be like shuluknight.com in our case, or like kieranwood.ca, or any of those sorts of domains are what you go out and buy. You buy those from domain name registrars, and then you set up DNS, which is a server that you then set all of your configurations for. And so one important thing to keep in mind when you're talking about this is that the domain name is basically, people call this the root domain. Most people, when they refer to domain name, refer to this whole thing. So it'll be mydomain.com, for example. And then you can have subdomains. People don't sometimes use these, sometimes don't. And then you have the protocol. So you can see here, this is HTTPS. So that HTTP part refers to the protocol that we're using. And then S just means it's been secured. So it's got a secure channel that it's connecting with, essentially. So when we're taking a look at shuluknight.com, for example, so if we take something like shuluknight.com/web, which isn't a site anymore because I changed it, I think it's /Scorch. Nope, let me go and try and find the page. It helps if I spell shuluknight right. There we go. So if I go to shuluknight.com, for example, and then I head to Scorch, when we're looking at this, shuluknight.com is going to be our domain, essentially, that we've purchased. The .com is what's called a top-level domain. There's .ca, .com, .org, .io, whatever. You can purchase different versions of these. The thing at the beginning, HTTPS, this is all of this part at the beginning is what's called the protocol. There's a couple different ones, HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, file. There's a whole bunch of other ones that you can use. And then there's this at the end here, which is /Scorch, and this is what's called the slug. And what this means is that once you get to the right computer, you get to the right port, you then also have different pages that are available. So like when we were looking at the Alan Turing site earlier, we have, once we get to kieranwood.ca/whatever, right? We've gotten to the right site, but now if we want to get to the right file, we have to know kind of where those different files are. And so the slug basically tells you what the different files are. And sometimes, like in the case of GitHub pages, it literally is just looking for that file inside of a folder. So when we're looking at something like Alan, and we see here my work, it is literally going to the computer, it's going to the domain, and then it's going and finding mywork.html. The only difference with our website, Scorch Ignite, is that you don't see the .html part. It's the exact same concept. It's going through, finding the file you need, and going from there. Okay. So yeah, once you've bought a domain, the question is, how do browsers know where to send people? And that's where DNS comes in, which I already mentioned earlier. But basically, this is the thing that actually converts everything across for you. You have your particular name and that you purchased, which is your domain name, and then you tell it where to go. And so google.com, for example, this might be the IP address for google.com. That'll be part of your DNS. And so unfortunately, there is more than one DNS. You'll find that there's one stored locally on your computer that your computer constantly updates when it finds new servers it has to go to. There's one in your browser, which also does the same thing. There's one on your network. There's one on your ISP. There's a whole bunch of these different ones. Oftentimes you'll find a lot of issues that come up are because people try and make this DNS stuff as fast as possible. And oftentimes they screw it up. So a lot of the times when you run into problems, it'll just be your DNS that's causing issues. So just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at it. But essentially, when we're looking at this, the authoritative source where we say like, hey, this is the correct one, this is the one that we actually care about, is what's called your name server. And so that basically is a thing where you say, hey, look, this DNS, this is the DNS that I set up myself. This is the one that's important to me. This is the one that I care about. And that's the one that you'll refer back to. Everything else will refer back to that. And if you want more details, there is a link here that'll go into more details. But essentially, DNS, the reason why it matters is that obviously you can use a domain name for more than one thing. Obviously, you can send email from a domain, which doesn't use HTTP. It uses a different protocol called SMTP. And so having DNS allows you to basically, that in-between step makes it easier for people to read the URL, but it also makes it so that you can send them to different places depending on what they're trying to do. So just keep that in mind. So let's look at how this actually works in order. So we type in scorchignite.com/beginner, right? We type it into a browser, we hit enter. Okay. This goes to our domain name registrar, the person that we purchased our domain name through. And then what it'll do is it'll respond with the name server. So this will be whatever the person is who's responsible for the DNS. Then it'll go back to the person who requested the URL, and it'll fire off a message saying, hey, I need the information about these types of records. So A, AAA, or quadruple A, and CNAME. Fancy ways of saying, I need to know where I need to go. The name server will respond with the information that you need, and it'll send it back to you. Once it does that, now, finally, what it'll do is it'll go back to the server that you actually have the actual like stuff on, and it'll send that same request again, and it'll ask for /beginner, which is the slug that was at the end of the URL that we were looking at, and then it'll get it back, essentially. And that will be where we'll get our first HTML for /beginner. And then this last step here, little Bobby will basically keep doing this over and over again for all the stuff that's available on the site. So it might be images, it might be CSS files, it might be whatever. It'll just keep doing that last step over and over and over again. But those first steps of figuring out the DNS server and getting all that information will happen once at the beginning, and then it'll just keep happening over and over again where it'll keep making requests to get the rest of the information. And then, yeah, so that's basically just what this is saying. It's just saying that it'll just keep responding with all the resources that you need from there. Okay. If you want to see how this all works like on your machine, keep in mind, I will warn you, if you run this on something that has a lot of servers that happen in between, it will run very slowly. But if you're interested, you can run tracert on Windows, and you can type whatever the host name is. So you can do like tracert google.ca and see exactly how, like what it's going through all the way. So you can see it go from your computer to your router, to your ISP, to them, and all the steps in between if you're interested. But just remember, if you do this and that chain is really long, it'll really, really slow down your computer. So just be careful. And if you do want to use a custom domain with GitHub Pages, like I said before, GitHub Pages is just HTTP. That's all it does. It's basically just like a glorified version of like Google Drive. And so essentially what this will do is you can buy the domain, point the name servers, and then do all that stuff. And there's documentation right there for how to do all that. Okay, so for the next time, we're going to talk about APIs. And so this is kind of cool. So we've talked about how to do network requests now. What we're going to talk about is basically how we can communicate with other services online and how we can make websites that will communicate with some sort of a backend. So we might have something running in the backend on Python, for example, and that might be doing all of our processing and doing all that stuff. And then we're going to get our actual HTML, our CSS, and our JavaScript to talk to our backend and go from there. We're also going to show you how to do things like this, where we can see here we have kind of a website that's essentially what it does is every time you type in the ID of a Pokemon, so like in this case, it's 3 for Venusaur, it's going to go off, it's going to check somebody else's database, and it's going to pull the information that we need from there. So we'll show you how to do all of that next time, which is really cool, and all the networking stuff that you need to be able to do that, as well as being able to build out our own APIs as well, which is cool. So other people can use our stuff. In the meantime, though, now that we know how to actually host websites, we're going to go through and host a few. So whenever you're submitting this one, by the way, you can literally just submit a file that just has a list of the URLs if you want to. You don't have to do anything else as far as that stuff goes. So level 1 is basically just using EasyCV to make a site. You can set up a couple of sites, essentially just either with EasyCV or as static sites. Just set up a few sites and then include links to them in project sections of your main site. So like if you did a couple of the previous exercises, what you can do is host a personal site with EasyCV or just do a static site. Doesn't really matter. Either one's fine. And then go through and then host a couple of other sites and then put links to those other sites on your main site, essentially. Level 2 is try using some sort of a variable in your pipeline. So your first step should be a workflow dispatch if you're going to do this. If you are going to do session level 2, just include the YAML file that you used for it as well. There's information online. If you Google GitHub pages, how do I add a variable? It'll tell you. And level 3 is going to be inside of a pipeline, try using some other type of action. So try doing minifying images or HTML or something else, whatever you want to use. You can just go to that same marketplace link that I sent earlier in the chat, which is just about their marketplace, and just try using one of the other things. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just try using a few and then add that as level 3. This can also be the same site that you use for level 1 as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you the last like 10, 15 minutes just to spend some time with your mentor, ask any questions you want, and then go from there. For mentors, stick around afterwards because we'll need to do a debrief. But for mentees, yeah, basically ask them questions. And then after that, you're free to go. So give you guys a chance to hop in the breakout room and go from there.